with the quote-unquote uncontrollable child. And yeah, I put that in quotation marks because it's a phrase that's actually used in the legislation, and it has created all kinds of difficulties in terms of dealing with troubled children and children who do come into contact with the state. Mrs. Gordon Harrison, thank you so much. Appreciate you joining us once again.
You're welcome. It's my pleasure, Dion.
Let me pick up where I actually left off. After you had left us at the last interview, I'd read there from your concluding remarks, which said the need to effectively address this problem is an urgent one and an embarrassing one. As stated in the introduction, it's not the intention to present something so unrealistic it becomes undoable. So tell me, what is it you're presenting that you think is eminently doable here?
All right. Well, first of all, Dion, if you look at the recommendations, even though there are 6 specific ones as itemized, the issue is we're focusing on one narrow issue. We're not here saying that we expect tomorrow a facility whereby there is a complete juvenile remand center, for example, for girls. We understand that that's a big ticket item. We understand that there are severe fiscal constraints that are affecting the country at this time. So the narrow nature of the recommendations, we believe, make them practical, and we believe makes them doable. It's not an expansive thing where we're coming with a raft of things, covering a number of issues, which we could come with, but we have chosen what we think is a very priority matter and a very narrow issue. Because if you look at the recommendations, the last 2, I think, based on how I've put it, are really of most urgency. There is one that speaks to having all the girls that are in the facility now examined both by psychiatrists and or psychologists to see if there are any underlying mental health issues, so that we can understand what is the nature of the problem that these girls face, and suitable intervention strategies can be undertaken. Secondly, we're talking about identifying safe houses. And there is a recommendation that I've made that's linked to that says, look, we understand if we're to get very ambitious to say purchase land and construct or buy existing properties, that could attract a very large outlay of cash. And so what we've said is let's look at leasing and renting. We have several government offices now that rent and have some very exorbitant rents. So how about redistributing the pie just a little bit to rent safe houses that we can use for these girls and to retrofit them as best as possible to ensure that the security issues are dealt with appropriately, and we have the girls removed in the short to medium term into these facilities that have been so equipped.
One of the things, so looking at a number of the recommendations, including the ones you mentioned, having any child deemed to be uncontrollable assessed by a forensic psychiatric professional, also having girls who are in adult detention facilities because they're so-called uncontrollable, having them professionally assessed by mental health experts and so on. But it sounds at the very least, though, as if it is going to require an injection of more psychiatric professionals into the system to work with these children.
Certainly it sounds that way, but I think we're very creative people. So there are 2 ways that you could perhaps look at it. It could mean increasing the number of persons who are currently within the government sector to treat with this need, or it could be to have persons who are in private practice have a kind of arrangement with the government facilities that once these girls are presented, or any child in fact, because in terms of the assessment before the court, before a correctional order is made, it's our position that it should obtain in all instances when any child is brought solely for behavioral problems. It could be that you use privately practicing psychiatrists to assist in this way, and there is some financial arrangement that's made with them that would not necessarily entail them being a part of the government establishment, so to speak.
Okay. What about, though, because presumably the assessment issue clearly very, very important, so we know what we're dealing with, what we need to assist with in terms of these children, but at the same time, having made the assessments, we're going to need treatment. And we saw coming out of Armadale, the Armadale report, one of the major concerns that had been highlighted is that the girls were badly in need of treatment, ongoing treatment, and they just weren't getting enough of it. So how do you deal with that aspect? Is it the same kind of arrangement you're thinking of?
It could be, but again, that would be a matter, I think, that if we get down to it on the operational level, for example, if the Department of Correctional Services, which falls within the rubric of the Ministry of National Security, says, look, there is no way we can afford to have all these professionals on staff, but we can have an arrangement perhaps with the Ministry of Health to say, we have this need, what is the best situation that we can work out? And if the Ministry of Health doesn't have the number of professionals available, then again an option would be to contract the services of privately operating psychiatrists to see how best they can fulfill the need.
In relation to what comes out of this report, Mrs. Gordon-Harrison, as you said, it's been sent to Parliament. Now, the last thing that you would want is for this to die in Parliament, for it to end up on the shelf somewhere. Yes. What do you have any idea what would become of it, what Parliament is likely to do?
Well, I can't say what Parliament is likely to do, but what I've done as well is, apart from just simply laying it on the table of the Houses, I have sought to isolate particular line ministers whose ministries will be directly impacted, to have them see the urgency of it. And I've explained in great detail in my covering letter that I would have sent it to them, urgency with which we need to move on this issue. So apart from having it be the general thing where Parliament sees it and nobody takes it forward, I've itemized perhaps about 5 of the ministers who I think are going to be severely impacted if any of the recommendations are taken on board. And the urge, of course, is for them to see the recommendations as a catalyst towards action.
I was just thinking, there are a number of parliamentary committees. Most of them don't meet nearly often enough, but there is one that deals with, I think, human and social and human resources issues or human resource development. Perhaps within the rubric of that committee, it would be interesting to see the committee examine the report and perhaps then also follow it up with recommendations to Parliament. Perhaps that's also a possibility.
Yes, that is in fact a very, very practical solution, or recommendation on your part, I should say.
In terms of the funding, because you're saying, okay, it's realistic, it's doable, what you're suggesting is doable, but in terms of taking it further, doing the kind of in-depth report or in-depth, what should I call, costing and so on, would that be something you would be hoping the ministries would do, or would your office be following through?
No, it would have to be something that is done by the various ministries that would be impacted. So, for example, the Safe House recommendation, I've said that the cohort of juveniles who are now already within the care of the DCS by virtue of being on correctional orders, my recommendation is this. The court cannot say where to place them in terms of which facility. And so if I'm making the recommendation that safe houses be created, then it would certainly be a line item for the Ministry of National Security / DCS to consider. So they would have to work that out. But what I can say, Dion, is something that we have done in the past, and we certainly have no difficulty doing it, that whereby there has been some kind of indication by a minister or a ministry that they intend to move in a particular direction. I've been consulted, for example, in terms of giving them advice and making concrete recommendations as to some of the things they need to look at when creating a budget to deal with a particular issue. So we have done written guidance to the ministers already on a particular issue where we have said, if you're looking at doing this kind of facility, these are the things that you would need to be guided by. We have done our research. Here are photographs of what is needed in terms of the kinds of fittings and so on. So we would have no difficulty assisting in terms of crafting, not the budget necessarily, but looking at some of the issues that must be considered when the budget is being crafted.
In terms of a kind of general time frame within which you would be hoping to hear back from the ministers, what do you think is reasonable?
I think if, certainly because we're in budget season now and we know it's called Cameron season, coming up to the end of the financial year, I would say anything within the first quarter of the new financial year would be reasonable in all the circumstances.
Can I ask you to hold on for just a moment? I have a couple of other issues I want to ask you about, but I'm up on the break. Can I just take the break and come right back?
Certainly.
All right. Talking to the Children's Advocate. We're back in a moment.
This is Beyond the Headlines from the RJR News Center.
And we're back with you. Beyond the Headlines continues now. This is RJR 94 FM. I'm Dion Jackson-Miller. We're speaking with children's advocate Dan Gordon Harrison against the background of recommendations that she sent to the Houses of Parliament focusing on the uncontrollable child. And let me just apologize very quickly to my listeners because, of course, I did just jump into the interview, which, of course, I should have just reminded you of the background. Let me just run through for you very quickly the 6 recommendations coming from the children's advocate. 1, that any child who is alleged to be uncontrollable, quote unquote, by his or her parent or one who has the care of the child should be subjected to an assessment by a forensic psychiatric professional. 2, that we need a facility that can accommodate those children who exhibit maladaptive behavior patterns and who need special services geared towards addressing those types of behavioral problems. 3, that in very extreme cases where the court determines that the child is best suited for placement in a correctional facility, that at the time the child is going into the facility, the Department of Correctional Services should undertake a complete psychiatric and psychological assessment of the child to ascertain the particular needs of the child so an appropriate program of care can be developed. 4, we have to realize that where the overarching aim of juvenile justice is to rehabilitate the juveniles, and therefore we need to look at what we're doing in terms of training and education, that the juveniles are being taught for an average of 2 hours per day. Listeners would remember I was absolutely shocked when I heard that, and that it's recommended that perhaps retired teachers could be brought into the system to help to provide increased hours of instruction. 5, in relation to girls who are now in adult detention centers because they are said to be quote unquote uncontrollable, each of them needs to be assessed by mental health experts to look at what's been happening with them as well as to see how to go forward. And 6, that suitable safe houses within existing communities be identified and equipped so that they can accommodate the cohort of these girls. And the committee I was making mention of Parliament is actually the Human Resources and Social Development Committee, chaired by Roddy Spencer, who is in fact himself a former Minister of Health and who would at one point have had these issues of children under his portfolio, I believe. So, Mrs. Gordon Harrison, so you're hoping, you're optimistic that we'll have some movement then, because we're good at the platitudes, we're good at the expressions of concern and we know how terrible things are, but we just don't seem to move fast enough on issues like this.
Yes, which is true. But I think that enough attention has been brought to this issue consistently, and not just the issue of the uncontrollable child, but increasingly, certainly I've been plotting for the last 12 months, the amount of attention and focus that has been geared towards the issue of our children. I think a clear precedent has been set, and I do believe that we really need to prioritize it. And as you say, the platitudes are good to a point, but then if we can translate those platitudes into actions, I think we'd be well on our way, and I can only hope and trust that, the recommendations are taken seriously. And you'll notice as well, Dion, that some of them may sound, a little far-fetched if you read it as a bold recommendation. But throughout the recommendations for each proposal that I've advanced, I've linked it back to an international instrument or local legislation which guides the thrust with which we need to be moving, certainly in relation to our children who are in conflict with the law. So they are squarely on all fours with the international obligations that we have, and they're in keeping with the spirit of the Child Care and Protection Act, which is the parent legislation that governs issues of this sort.
And which also says that we're clearly not meeting some of those international obligations. Is that correct?
Yes, that is in fact correct, yes.
So on that particular issue then, is your approach going to be one of what should I say, dialogue? Not just in the first instance, but is that the approach your office is taking to try and move forward on this issue?
Yes, well, as I said, going back to the line ministers that I have singled out in terms of sending the report to them, there is actually an offer in the letter that accompanied the report that if there is need for any dialogue, as we suspect that there might be, we are open to advancing the dialogue. And certainly, if the first step isn't taken by the ministers, then I have no difficulty, and it is in fact my intention to reach out to them very specifically after a specific period has passed to ask for that dialogue to be initiated and for it to be continued on a need-to basis.
I think some of the concerns had been in relation to how your office has operated prior to you coming on, is that the office does have a lot of power under the Child Care and Protection Act, but really hasn't pushed government enough, hasn't gone to the line enough, hasn't said to government, all right, look, you need to do better, in other words, and then push harder on that. Is that something you're going to be doing?
Well, as I said, Dion, my style really is that if the circumstances so warrant it, then we assess it and we decide what is the best way forward to achieve the results that we are actually targeting and that we are determined to achieve. So as I said, in this clear example, yes, we have done the recommendations. I think we have done them in a way that they recognize the import of them in terms of the obligations that the state has really committed us to by virtue of signing the various conventions and protocols, but also that it can't stop there. So if there is an issue, then, we're not saying that, we can push it to the point ridiculous, but certainly that issue needs to be discussed with us, and then we can see how best we can work around that issue. And it really, for me, is about partnership. It's about showing you the direction that we think you should go in based on the various obligations that we have. And from there, having a two-way dialogue whereby we can partner to see how best we can achieve the results. The ridiculous extension of that, Dion, is that sometimes, I wish that, my lobbying powers were greater, certainly with certain international agencies. And I'm speaking now from the perspective of even funds, because I'm at the stage in terms of how I see this partnership with the government, that if I could even secure the funds to give them to identify the safe houses, that is the level I'm at to see how best we can funnel the resources for the particular purpose.
But I think some advocates might want to see you speaking out, not just speaking out. Let me rephrase that. Not just speaking out, but perhaps even going to the court. Is that something that's an option?
Each situation, Dion, as you would appreciate, as counsel, must turn on its own set of facts. And as counsel who has a lot of experience in the courts and who has a great regard for strategic interventions, I don't believe in going to the court for just going to the court's sake. You go to the court when there is a very clear issue and one that is very arguable. So it's not about just making a frivolous kind of application. And I use frivolous here, not in terms of the subject matter, but in terms of the regard for the precedent in court and the legal issues that would come to the fore in any particular court that would have to consider the various factors that have to be determined. And so I cannot say carte blanche that, yes, I will go to court for this, because I know the suggestion has been made that, you should go to court because these children are in correctional facilities. But if you look at it from a legal perspective, a correctional order is tantamount to a sentence of the court. And with all sentences, there are time limits for lodging an intention to appeal, for example, and thereafter in terms of filing your grounds and so on. So, you have to look at the processes that exist, that govern the way in which we practice, and each assessment must be made on what obtains to the particular issue at the particular time. So I can't say a blanket statement, yes, I'll go to court. I'm a lawyer, and my training has guided me thus far in making responsible decisions and equally responsible utterances.
Well, in terms of, for instance, seeking declarations, declaration that Jamaica is not, in fact, adhering with some of the international conventions you are speaking of, is that something that would make any sense?
It could in certain instances, yes.
Let me just ask you before I run out of time, though, what's the issue of parents? Because part of the difficulties that we do have, and I know many of the parents have the difficulties themselves in terms of, boy, I can't manage, hand him over to the police, or take her, or want to take him, or whatever. Yes. What about an intervention at that level? Because there are many parents, every time we have these discussions, they text me and they say, we're pulling out our hair, we don't know what else to do.
Well, one of the recommendations, I don't remember which one it is, spoke about the need to have perhaps group counseling sessions that would have not just the children who are, in fact, the subject of these discussions, but would also include affected family members, to include parents and caregivers who have to treat with the children. We recognize that oftentimes, if not all times, when children manifest behavioral problems, it must have an impact on the parent. Whether it is that the parenting skills are not at the best, or that the parent is trying all that he or she can, but the child is just being very deviant. We recognize that it has to be a joined-up approach. So the parents need support in terms of helping them to cope with the difficult situations. And some of the parents need support, as sad as it is, Leon, in terms of best practices in parenting.
Oh, man, parenting hard, man.
It is, and they don't come with a direction.
With a manual, yeah.
Manual. So we understand that there are parents who do have challenges, and we think that we need to have a joined-up approach whereby the discussion can include not just the child but also the parent, because the fact of the matter is, when the child interfaces with the system, even if we had the best services in the world, and that child is exposed to all the counseling and the psychological support and the therapeutic interventions, if we fix up that child, so to speak, and then send the child back to a dysfunctional home or to a parent who is not equipped to continue guiding the child in terms of positive life choices, then you're going to be right back at square one.
Going to have to leave it there. We thank you so much for your time this evening. We look forward to talking to you in the future. Thank you so very much.
Okay, then.
Children's advocate Dan Gordon Harrison talking to us there.